Not really a sermon today, just some observations, if you will. Would you turn to Mark chapter 15, found on page 722 of your Pew Bible. Mark chapter 15, starting with verse 33. Mark 15, starting with 33, page 722 of your Pew Bible. Mark chapter 15, beginning with verse 33, we're going to read to verse 41. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. That's all we're going to read. And I'm not going to talk about the women there, but it's really something to notice that the women were perhaps more faithful than all. Jesus on the cross, that's what's going on here. Verse 33 states, at the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. Who can tell me what the 6th hour and the 9th hour were? Anybody?
Noon time and 3 p.m.
Noon and 3, right? So they were measuring the hour of the day by the approximate sunrise hour, which would be 6 a.m. And so the 6th hour would be noon, and the 9th hour would be 3 p.m. Very good. Back in verse 25, we're informed it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. So they crucified Jesus at 9 a.m., right? Approximately. So altogether, Jesus hung on the cross for about 6 hours, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., the 3rd hour to the 9th hour. Our passage focuses in on the halfway point of the crucifixion. It starts off at the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. So the brightest part of the day became the darkest part of the day, that day. The darkness came over the whole land, Mark says, from noon until 3. Mark writes whole land, not whole earth, but whole land. So it was most likely a localized darkness, either over the Jerusalem area or over all of Israel. It wasn't an eclipse. People are all excited about an eclipse these days. When do we get an eclipse? In another week or so? Something like that? It wasn't an eclipse. It was, an eclipse wouldn't last 3 hours. It was 3 hours of supernatural darkness, a sign of judgment, a sign of tragedy. Next verse, verse 34. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is quoting Psalm, anybody know? Psalm 22. If you looked it up right now, don't look it up, but if you looked it up, you would read the same exact thing. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then it goes on, why are you so far from saving me? So far from the words of my groaning. So far, so far. Jesus wasn't asking Elijah to save him. Elijah sounds a little bit like Eloi. That's why there might have been confusion. When some of those standing there near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. But deception and self-deception is a slippery slope. If you believe one lie, you're very more likely to believe the next lie. If you allow yourself to compromise the truth here, you will compromise the next truth probably very easily. Pretty soon you mistake, in this case, Jesus crying out to God for crying out to Elijah. Soon you're looking in all the wrong places, having all the wrong responses. One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. That's a false narrative now that this guy was following and the people were following. Have you heard about false narratives? It happens when you allow yourself to believe a lie, and then another lie, and then another lie, and you lose track of the truth. You lose the grounding of solid truth. Now they're believing a false narrative that Elijah was coming to save Jesus. No. If anybody was coming to save anybody, it was Jesus coming to save Elijah. But they had already gotten it so backwards. So Jesus wasn't crying out for Elijah, he was crying out to God. Something I did not know, had never noticed, and just read yesterday for the first time, according to one of my trustworthy New Testament scholars, R.T. France. Listen to this. This is the only time Jesus does not address God as Father. The only time. The only time, this one and only time, Jesus does not address God as Father. That is super significant. And many of you already know the significance of it. It was because this was the one and only time there was ever distance between the two. The Son, Jesus, and the Father. Distance between the Father and the Son. Normally, and for all eternity, they had been the definition of inseparable. In John chapter 14, Jesus says to Philip, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show me the Father? Show us the Father. Don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you are not just my own, rather it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. That's how it normally was between the Father and the Son. That's how it had always been. But not from the 6th hour to the 9th hour while Jesus hung on the cross. When darkness came over the whole land. For the first time, for the one and only time ever, the Father and the Son were separated from the 6th hour when darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. Of course, darkness came over the whole land. The darkest point in the history of the universe when the first person was separated from the second person of the Trinity for the first time in ever and ever and ever. It had never happened before. It would never happen again. Everyone else had distanced themselves from the Son, from Jesus, including all the apostles. Now is the Heavenly Father doing it as well? The answer is yes. The Heavenly Father is doing it, separating himself from the Son. The Apostle Paul tells us about it. He says in Galatians 3:13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Basically, because all of us have sinned, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We're all under a curse, all separated from God ourselves in our natural state. So Christ took our curse, our separation upon himself, substituted himself so that we might be free. And that was what was going on at the 6th hour when darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. Because for the first time in all of eternity, the Father and the Son were separated. The Father necessarily separated from the Son because the Son had become a curse for us. How did the Son become a curse for us? What was the mechanism of that? Well, Paul continues in Galatians with, for it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. It wasn't by accident that Jesus was crucified. It was very much on purpose. Cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. What a curious thing for the Apostle Paul to say. He's actually quoting an obscure little command in the law of Moses, in the 5th book of Moses, Deuteronomy. And let me quote it for you. If a man, Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23, if a man guilty of a capital offense is put to death and his body is hung on a tree, you must not leave his body on the tree overnight. Be sure to bury him that same day, because anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. Someone might protest, but Jesus wasn't hung on a tree, he was hung on a cross. In Hebrew, it's the same thing. A cross is hewn from a tree. Christ was hung on a cross, hewn from a tree. He was hung on a tree. And anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. Who knew? Who knew? Until the Apostle Paul points it out in Galatians. God knew about that obscure little law back in the 5th book of Moses. It was essentially another one of his prophecies about how he would take care of our curse. It was essentially pointing to Jesus' death on the cross for us, on a tree for us. And so that's how God did it. It was the plan all along, and it had to occur if we were ever going to be free of the curse ourselves. And we are all under the curse ourselves, because again, Deuteronomy, 5th book of Moses, declares, cursed is the man who does not uphold the words of this law by carrying them out. In other words, cursed is everyone who can't do it perfectly. And so, that's all of us until Jesus became a curse for us by hanging on a tree. And so, of course, he cried out at that time, my God, why have you forsaken me? And of course, at the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. the Son had become a curse and separated from the Father for the first time ever and ever. Just a bit more observation before we go today, verse 37 and 38 of our passage. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. From top to bottom, Mark specifies to let you know that it was God who did it. He's up on top. He's the only one who could tear it from top to bottom. But why? Why was the curtain torn in two? For the Thursday night service this past week, the worship team was preparing a song, and Marcia was preparing a song, a very pretty song for the communion celebration that we had that night, called In Remembrance. In remembrance of me, eat this bread. In remembrance of me, drink this wine. I'm not singing it right. Anyway, if you were there, you remember it. A very pretty song. Near the end of the song, though, there were some words that caused us, many of us on the worship team, to balk a little bit. We didn't think they were maybe correct, theologically accurate. And here are the words. In remembrance of me, don't look above, but in your heart. Look in your heart for God. To me, that sounded a little, I don't know, too touchy-feely. God is above. Why would you look to God above? And others felt the same way. But the truth is, unless God comes that close, so that he is in your heart, he can't do you any good. He will not save you from above. He must come into the very heart of you. That's salvation. That's a relationship with God. And that's why the curtain in the temple was torn in two. The curtain was there to separate God from us, humanity. If you're looking for God behind the curtain or above because he's not in your heart, then you're in big trouble. Because the only place he can save you is from within, when he's invited in by faith, to be born again in you, if you will. The curtain of the temple represented the separation between God and man, but Jesus, becoming a curse for us, separating himself for us, removed the separation for us by becoming our substitute, our perfect cleansing sacrifice on the cross, hung on a tree. From the 6th hour when darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour when the temple curtain was torn in two and the separation between God and man removed. For the first time ever. Even the saints, this gets confusing to people, but even the saints of old who died before Jesus was around, his death counted backwards for them, if you will, as long as they had put their faith in God for salvation, although they didn't have the full revelation of how God was going to do it. And that's the way it works today. We don't have to have the full revelation of heaven, for example, to go there. It's about faith in God. That's the revelation we need. That's all the revelation we need. The separation of God and man was now removed. Finally, verse 39 of our passage, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. And when, like the centurion, we come to that same revelation, the curtain of separation between us and God is torn in two. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of a human decision or a husband's will, but born of God.